The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was already a bad sign. Tuesdays in the U.S. EF liaison office on Luna Base were the kind of days where the coffee machine broke and the paperwork didn't. And Staff Sergeant Jana Voss had learned over the course of a 9-year military career to treat Tuesdays the way you treat a dog you don't know, with basic respect and a lot of personal space. She was at her desk when Colonel Hargrove dropped the envelope in front of her. Physical envelope, actual paper. The kind of thing you only saw when someone wanted to make a point. She looked at it, looked at Hargrove. "You're going to want to open that," he said. "Is it bad news? That depends entirely on you." She opened it, read it once, read it again slower because the first read hadn't made sense, and she wanted to give the second read a fair shot. The Velshira Institute for Strategic Excellence cordially extended an invitation to one representative of the United Sol Earth Federation for enrollment in the current cycle of the Galactic Accord's premier military education program to commence in 37 standard days, duration 14 months, full diplomatic and academic standing, guaranteed under Accord Charter Article 9 subsection. She stopped reading the subsections. The Velshira Institute. She said, "Yes, the one that's been running for 600 years, 612. Technically, the one where they train the top military minds from about 40 civilizations, 47 currently." Jana set the letter down, picked up her coffee. It was cold. She drank it anyway because wasting coffee on a Tuesday felt like admitting defeat. "Colonel," she said. "Why me?" Hargrove had the look of a man who had prepared for this question and still didn't look. His answer, "Lieutenant Graves was the original selection. He's been in medical for 5 days, stomach bug something he ate, so I'm the backup. You're the representative of humanity to the most prestigious military institution in the known galaxy because Graves ate something funny." "Jana, I'm just making sure I have the full picture." "Sir." Hargrove sat down across from her. He was a big man, square-jawed, the kind of officer who had come up through the enlisted ranks and never forgot it, which was exactly why Jana had always trusted him more than most. He folded his hands on the desk. "You speak 3 languages. Your security clearance is current. Your performance reviews use words like unconventional, which in this context means you think faster than your rank should allow." He paused, and the Institute's invitation was very specific about wanting someone with field experience. Not a general, not a diplomat, someone who has actually done the thing. "Kepler Station," Jana said, among other things. She looked at the letter again. 37 days, 14 months. A place that had never in 612 years invited a human being. "Why now?" she asked. "Why any of this? Why does the Accord suddenly want a human in that school?" Hargrove was quiet for a moment. "One vote," he said. "Admissions committee, the vote to invite Earth passed by one tuper," she thought. About that, one vote out of however many ancient alien minds had sat around whatever ancient alien table they used, and the whole thing had tipped over onto her Tuesday like a cold cup of coffee. "Who cast it?" she asked. "A Keth admiral named Thesson or..." Hargrove slid a thin briefing folder across the desk. "Curator Admiral. He runs the Institute's Strategic Theory Division, 400 years old approximately by our calendar. Considered either the most serious military philosopher in the Accord or the most elaborate practical joker depending on who you ask. I ask. Jana opened the folder. The image inside showed a Keth tall, silver-spined, 4 arms folded in what the caption described as a posture of formal consideration. His eyes were the pale gold that all Keth had, and they looked in the photograph like the eyes of something that had been watching the galaxy long enough to find it predictable. He thinks this is funny, Jana said. It wasn't a question. Hargrove didn't deny it. The prevailing theory in the diplomatic corps is that the invitation is a sociological experiment, that the committee majority went along with it because they see it as low risk. Humanity is new. Humanity is small. One human in a school full of ancient civilizations is from a certain angle a harmless curiosity. Jana closed the folder. But you're going anyway, Hargrove said. It also wasn't a question. She looked at him. Do I have a choice? Technically, yes, sir, she said, with the patience of a woman who had held a pressure door closed with her body for 46 minutes. When has technically yes ever meant yes? He almost smiled. 37 days. I'll have your travel packet ready by end of week. She packed that night, not because she needed to. 37 days was plenty of time, but because packing gave her hands something to do, while her brain did the part it did. Without asking permission, the going over everything part, the checking all the angles part. She had 3 thermoses. She packed all 3. Military grade, vacuum sealed, rated to -40. The shuttle would have its own food service, but she had been in enough unfamiliar places to know that the line between unfamiliar food and nothing familiar at all was a line worth having. Backup for her bunkmate, Corporal Reed, sat on the opposite bed and watched her fold things with the focused attention of someone who had decided this was more interesting than sleep. The Velshira Institute, Reed said. Yep, that's the one the Morathi go to. The Morathi. Jana, they've been in space since before we had writing. I'm aware, and they invited a human. One human, me, because Graves ate bad something. What are you going to do there? Jana looked up from the thermos she was packing. Learn. Presumably. It's a school, you know. What I mean, she did. Reed meant, what are you going to do when you're the only human in a room full of species that have been running civilizations for millennia? What are you going to do when you are, by every measurable standard of galactic history, the new thing, the young thing, the thing that everyone else has already made up their mind about before you open your mouth? Same thing I always do, Jana said, and went back to packing. Reed watched her for another minute. I looked up the Velshira Institute's records, publicly available stuff. They have something called a final assessment. No one knows exactly what it is, but it's different every cycle, and it's live, not simulated. Noted. Live, Jana. As in real consequences. Reed. Yeah. Go to sleep. Reed went to sleep. Jana finished packing, then she sat on the edge of her bunk in the dark for a while, not sleeping, listening to the hum of Luna Base doing what it always did, moving air, regulating pressure, keeping 40,000 people alive through sheer infrastructural stubbornness. She thought about the letter, the one vote, the photograph of Thesson, or with his ancient gold eyes. She thought about the word that Hargrove hadn't used, but that had been sitting in the briefing folder. Anyway, in the section titled Times, Public Accord Communications regarding Human Civilization compiled, the word was times manageable, used in 17 separate diplomatic communications over the last 40 years. Humanity is developing at a manageable pace. Human space expansion is proceeding within manageable parameters. Human technological capability is currently within manageable range. Manageable. She had heard that word her whole life in one shape or another, from teachers who meant she was too loud, from commanding officers who meant she moved faster than her rank allowed, from the panel that reviewed the Kepler station incident and gave her a commendation with one hand and a note about insubordination with the other. Manageable times was what you called a thing you had already decided wasn't a threat. She picked up her orders packet and read it through one more time in the dark. Then she put it in the top compartment of her bag next to the thermoses and lay down and closed her eyes. Not my first rodeo, she thought, and meant it to be funny, and found that it mostly was. The shuttle to the Accord Transit Hub took 9 hours. Jana slept through 4 of them, ate a questionable protein pack through 2 more, and spent the remaining 3 reading everything publicly available about the Velshira Institute, which turned out to be considerable in volume and thin on useful detail. She learned the Institute had graduated 43 individuals who later became the supreme military commanders of their respective civilizations. She learned the campus was a converted generation ship, ancient and vast, hollowed into something between a university and a monastery. She learned the curriculum covered strategic theory, multi-species coalition tactics, logistics under alien environment conditions, and something called philosophical warfare, which the brief described as the study of how a civilization's deepest assumptions about life and death shape its fighting doctrine. That last one she read twice. She thought about the war games she'd run in training, the scenarios her instructors had called unwinnable, the way she'd learned early and permanently that times unwinnable. Times was usually just another word for times. I haven't found the angle yet. She wondered if that was a human thing or a Jana thing, or just a true thing that nobody had gotten around to writing down. Yet the transit hub was enormous. That was the first thing, the sheer size of it, built for bodies that ranged from roughly her height to things she couldn't comfortably estimate without a reference point. The lighting was low and varied different spectrums for different visual ranges, and the result was something between a cathedral and an aquarium, beautiful, a way that made her feel small and didn't apologize for it. Her escort was waiting at the gate of a Velshika, tall, iridescent, the kind of graceful that looked like it took no effort and probably took centuries. It held a data slate with her name on it. Jana walked up. That's me. Velshika looked at her. This part took a moment. She had been looked at by aliens before Earth's diplomatic hub had enough traffic that it wasn't her first contact, not by a long stretch, but this was different. This was the particular quality of attention that comes from someone adjusting their expectations in real time. The Velshika had clearly had a picture in its mind of what a representative of the human military would look like, and Jana was currently in the process of not matching it. She was 56. She had short dark hair and the kind of face that looked permanently like it was about to say something that would make someone else's day harder. She was carrying a standard kit bag and, notably, a bag that appeared to contain thermoses, and she was looking back at the Velshika with the patient-level attention of a woman who had stood in a lot of rooms where she didn't belong and had long since made her peace with it. The Velshika adjusted its posture. Jana recognized it a second later for what it was, the physical suppression of something, not rudeness, something else. The equivalent of pressing your lips together. She smiled. Permission to come aboard, she said. The Velshika's iridescent skin did something subtle around its throat that she couldn't read. Yet, it made a note on the data slate and gestured toward the transit corridor. Welcome to the Institute's reception. Process Sergeant Voss, it said in flawless English. Please follow me. She followed. The corridor stretched ahead of them, long and lit in shifting colors, full of the sounds of a place built around serious work. Somewhere ahead was a school that had been running for 612 years. Somewhere ahead were 31 other cadets who had been selected by consensus, by reputation, by the weight of civilizations behind them. Somewhere ahead was a curriculum that included philosophical warfare and one Keth admiral who had cast one vote and was by two competing theories, either the most serious mind at the table or the most elaborate joke. Jana walked. She had read the word times, manageable times 17 times in the briefing folder. She didn't feel manageable. She didn't feel dangerous either. She felt the way she always felt, walking into a new situation, like a problem looking for its own solution, like a door that was about to find out whether it was locked. 37 days ago she had been drinking cold coffee on a Tuesday. 14 months, the letter had said. She had packed 3 thermoses. Her quarters were smaller than expected and smelled like filtered air with a faint note of something floral she couldn't place. There was a bunk, a desk, a viewport standard. She had lived in worse. She set the thermoses on the desk and looked out the viewport. The Institute's orbital position gave her a view of the starfield that no window on Luna Base ever had. Unobstructed, vast, more stars than dark. In every direction she looked, the kind of view that did something to your chest, whether you asked it to or not. She stood there for a while with her hands in her pockets. Home was out there, somewhere 40-something light years. You couldn't see the sun from here with the naked eye. It was too far, too faint. Lost in the crowd, she knew the direction roughly. She looked at the part of the sky it should be in. Nothing distinguished it from any other patch of dark. She thought about her mother's kitchen, the way the light came in at 7:00 in the morning, the coffee that was always better than anything she'd had anywhere else, not because it was special coffee, but because it was that coffee, in that place with that light. 40-something light years. She unpacked her thermoses, set them in a line on the desk, looked at them with the affection a person reserves for objects that have never once let them down. Well, hell, she thought. She made her bunk with military corners because old habits were structural, not decorative. She set her data pad to local time. She read through the orientation schedule for the next morning. Introductions, facility tour, initial assessment, testing. Then she set the pad down and looked at the ceiling in the dark. 31 other cadets, the best the Accord had to offer, species that had been waging war and building strategy for longer than humanity had been lighting fires in Jana Voss, who was here because Graves ate something funny. On a Tuesday, she thought about Thessener, his gold eyes in the photograph, the single vote that had tipped everything sideways. She didn't think it was a joke. She couldn't have told you why, just a feeling, the kind she'd learned to trust, the feeling she got when a situation looked simple on the surface but had weight underneath it. The way a floor feels before it gives. Something was here, something real. She didn't know its shape yet. 14 months she closed her eyes. Outside, the stars didn't move because they never did from this distance. They just held their positions in the dark, enormous, impatient, burning without asking anyone's permission. Jana slept. The first morning at the Institute smelled like something between a library and a storm. Jana figured out later that it was the ventilation system pulling from the hydroponic wing, mixing ship recycled air with whatever 20 different species had decided counted as comfortable. The result was not unpleasant, it was just deeply, specifically alien, the kind of smell that reminded you, without hostility, that you were nowhere near Kansas. She was up at 500 because her body hadn't gotten the memo about transitioning to local time. She found the commissary, located something that qualified as coffee by the loosest possible definition, and sat at the end of a long table with her data pad and her thoughts, and the aggressive quiet of a space that wasn't used to being occupied this early. By 600 she had read through the week's schedule twice and made notes, the parts that seemed like they were going to be interesting. By 6:30 she had gone for a run. Cadet Velso of the Keth saw her come back. Velso was 17 years into an expected lifespan of 300, which put it at roughly the equivalent of a human's late teens in biological terms, though its cognitive development was considerably further along. The Keth front-loaded their neural complexity, growing into their intelligence the way some things grew into their wingspan. It had been at the Institute for 4 months before Jana arrived, which was long enough to have formed opinions. It had formed many opinions about humans in advance of her arrival. These opinions were based on the xenobiological files, the Accord's diplomatic correspondence, and a 340-page comparative analysis titled Times, Terran Apex Predator Cognition and Its Implications for Coalition Warfare, which had been circulated among the cadets when the invitation to Earth was announced. The analysis was thorough, well-sourced, and as Velso was now beginning to understand, watching Jana Voss come through the corridor hatch at a light jog with her cheeks flushed and her expression completely, infuriatingly, content not especially useful. She saw Velso and stopped. "Morning," she said. Velso processed. This, morning times as a greeting, was a human convention, a reference to the local time used as social contact, not as informational statement. It filed. "This, good morning, Sergeant Voss," it said. "Jana's fine." She pulled the collar of her jacket down to let the heat out. "You're Velso, right, Keth? I read the bios." "You read all of the cadet bios? Hard habit to break. You want to know who's in the room with you?" She looked at the thermos in her hand, decided it had cooled enough to drink, and drank from it. "Were you heading to the commissary?" "I'll walk with you unless that's weird." Velso considered whether it was weird. It arrived at times, inconclusive times, and said, "It is not weird." They walked. The corridor was starting to fill with Other cadets now, the early ones, the ones whose species ran on shorter sleep cycles. Jana nodded at a few of them, with the easy acknowledgement of someone who was comfortable in crowds without needing to perform it. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes, you were watching me come back from the run. What were you trying to figure out? Velso was quiet for 3 steps. The honest answer was, I was trying to file you under the correct category, and I have so far been unable to. It said instead, I was curious why you were running. Felt like it. You were not required to run. There was no training scheduled. I know. Then why? Because my brain runs faster than I'd like sometimes, and it helps to give my legs something to do. She said it without particular weight, the way you state a fact about weather. Also, I like it. The running clears things out. Velso filed runs for psychological regulation. Recreational. Then it looked at its own filed note and felt the note was insufficient. Recreational running as anxiety management times was in the xenobiological file, but the file had presented it as a coping behavior, something the human did times despite times discomfort, pushing through the stress response. Jana had not looked like she was pushing through anything. She had looked like a person coming home. The introductory assessment took place in a large circular room with tiered seating and a central floor that could be configured for different scenarios. Jana sat in the third between a Morathi cadet named Thesenmir, long-limbed, rust-colored, approximately as old as the Institute itself by Accord time reckoning, and an empty seat that a species requiring liquid immersion would occupy via sealed mobile tank, currently absent. Curator Admiral Thesson or stood at the room's center. In the photograph he had looked formidable. In person he was more than that. He was the kind of presence that rearranged the air around him, not through aggression, but through the particular weight of something that had been paying attention for 400 years and had no intention of stopping. His forearms were folded in a posture that Jana now recognized from her orientation, reading as high formal. Keth, the posture of someone who considered the room worth their complete attention. He looked at the cadets for a long moment. His gold eyes moved too. Jana stayed there for 2 seconds, moved. On 2 seconds was a long time. You are here, or said, because your respective civilizations believe you are worth the investment. This assessment will tell us what you are worth to each other. He moved to the scenario console. You will each be given the same strategic problem. You will work it alone. You will present your reasoning. We are not looking for the correct answer. We are looking for the shape of how you think. He activated the console. The scenario that appeared in the holographic display above the central floor was a siege problem, classic construction, the kind with a long history in military theory. A defending force, an attacking force, with overwhelming numbers. Terrain that favored neither. Supply lines that both sides had already damaged. The scenario notes included a line at the bottom, small and easy to miss. No viable path to victory exists for the defending force using standard doctrine. Jana read that line, looked at the scenario, read the line again. She started working. The presentations took most of the day. They were by any measure impressive. The Sandmere of the Morathi presented a 40-step tactical withdrawal sequence that preserved 73% of the defending force while surrendering the position, a solution. The Institute's evaluators had already classified as optimal a Velshika cadet named Orencel presented a communication strategy for negotiated surrender that preserved the defending forces' political standing at a cost of territorial loss. A Dreth cadet whose name translated approximately as times, the one who runs toward sound, times, presented a last stand doctrine rooted in its species warrior tradition, an honorable defeat that would have passed into its civilization's military history as an example worth teaching. All of them in their different ways had looked at times no viable path to victory times and had found peace with it. They had worked within it. That was the sophisticated response. That was the response of civilization that had learned over many centuries how to lose well. Jana was called forth. She stood at the central console and pulled up the scenario and said, "The scenario says there's no viable path to victory using standard doctrine." A pause. "That is correct," or said from his observation position. "I'm not going to use standard doctrine," she said. Room was quiet in a specific way, not empty quiet, but the quiet of 31 people deciding whether to be interested or offended. "The defending force has a supply problem," Jana said. "Both sides do, but the attackers have a bigger one because they're moving and their lines are extended. Standard doctrine says you have to hold the position. I'm not holding the position." She moved pieces on the holographic display. "I'm going to make them think I'm holding the position, then I'm going to abandon everything that isn't my people and hit their supply lines here, here and here, and I'm going to keep hitting them until one of two things happens. They withdraw because they can't sustain the engagement, or they win the position and find nothing in it worth having." She stopped. "What is your projected casualty rate?" or asked. "Higher than Thesenmir's withdrawal sequence, lower than the one who runs toward sound's last stand and the equipment loss, total. Everything that isn't breathing." The silence changed shape. She could feel it, the texture of 31 minds encountering something that didn't fit where they'd planned to put it. "You would destroy your own assets," Thesenmir said. It was not quite a question. The tone was closer to careful. "With the people, replace the equipment." Later, Jana said, "Gear doesn't grieve, people do." She sat down at the observation console or made a note. She couldn't read his expression. Keth faces didn't map to human emotional signaling. But he had gone still in the way that things go still when they are paying very close attention. The medical intake happened on day 2. It was standard procedure. Every cadet's biological baselines mapped for the Institute's medical systems, since the staff needed to know what normal looked like for every species before they could identify abnormal. Jana sat in the medical bay and let the medtech, a 4-limbed Velshika named Saurus, run the standard array. It took longer than it should have. At one point the scanning equipment paused and reset. Saurus checked the calibration twice. "Is something wrong?" asked. "The equipment is functioning correctly," Saurus said in a careful tone. "I am reviewing the neurological sensitivity mapping." "What about it?" Saurus looked at the display, looked at Jana, looked at the display again. "Your highest registered acute discomfort event in the past 7 days was assessed as a 3.2 on the standard physiological distress scale." "Okay, that is in the range we classify as minor. Irritant comparable to, for instance, a small surface cut. Right, what was the event? Jana considered. Headache. Pretty bad one, actually. I was out of coffee for about 6 hours. Soros was quiet for a moment. Out of coffee, it said. I had a backup thermos, but it was the wrong blend. Still helps, but it's not the same. She paused. Is this a problem? Soros looked at the pain mapping data on the display, the chart that should have shown somewhere in the past week. The standard indicators of physical strain from a person who had run 14 km, participated in 2 sparring assessments, and sat through 16 hours of orientation presentations and seating, calibrated for bodies that were not hers. The chart was almost flat, not because she hadn't experienced discomfort. The physiological data was clear. She had, her muscles had, her joints had, her nervous system had registered all of it in the standard way. The disconnect was in how it had been processed. Somewhere between sensation and response, something in Jana Voss had looked at the incoming discomfort data, made a rapid assessment, filed it under times not important right now, and moved on. Soros filed a supplemental report to 3 departments. The report was titled Anomalous Pain Response Classification. Human Cadet Preliminary Findings. You're all set, it told Jana. Great, Jana said, and went to find coffee. Day 3, Velso found her on the observation deck at 400, not looking for her, just there for its own reasons. And then there she was, sitting on the bench in front of the main viewport with her legs crossed and a thermos in her hands and her eyes on the stars. It sat down at the other end of the bench. She didn't react with surprise, which meant she had heard it coming. They sat in silence for a while. This was comfortable. Velso had not expected silence with a human to be comfortable, but the xenobiological file had apparently missed some things. You can't sleep? Jana asked. My sleep cycle is shorter than most humanoid species. I have several hours of productive quiet time before the facility activates. Me too. Well, not the short sleep cycle. I just wake up early. She turned the thermos in her hands. Old habit. Farm country. Light comes in early. You grew up in an agricultural area. Kansas, flat as a board and twice as boring, according to people who have never been there. I think it's beautiful, Kansas. Velso looked at the viewport. Stars. Does it look like this at night? Not quite. You can see more from here. No atmosphere getting in the way. She was quiet for a moment. But yeah, sort of. You get far enough from the town lights and it opens up. Big sky. Another pause. My mom still lives there. Same house I grew up in. Velso processed this. Personal history offered voluntarily, unprompted, not a tactical disclosure, just a fact shared in the way that people share warmth, because the gesture of sharing costs nothing and lands somewhere. The Keth do not have family structures in the way humans do. Velso said, my development cohort is my primary social unit. Are they here? No. I am the only Keth cadet this cycle. Jana looked at it. First time away from your cohort? Yes. How is that? Velso thought about this honestly. Strange, manageable. Jana made a sound that Velso's translation matrix identified as a short laugh, not mocking. Something else, recognition maybe. I've been called that, she said. Manageable. It was not intended as an Insult, I know. She drank from the thermos. Never is. They sat with the stars for another hour. Velso did not file the conversation anywhere. Some things didn't have a category. That was it. Was beginning to understand. Sometimes just the shape of a true thing. At the end of the first week, Velso updated its working assessment of Jana Voss. The original file had used words like times aggressive, high risk tolerance, potentially destabilizing to group cohesion, requires management. Velso crossed out times requires management times and wrote something else. Then it looked at what it had written and sat with it. What it had written was, she already knows she's the variable. She came anyway. I do not have a category for this. Oh, down the corridor, Jana was in the strategy room staring at a new scenario with the focused stillness of someone who had already found the angle and was now just checking her math. The scenario said no viable solution exists. She made a note. Note said, check what the scenario assumes I won't do. She found it in 6 minutes. This time, the scenario assumed she valued symmetry. She didn't. She started writing. 2 months in, the other cadets stopped trying to file her. It happened gradually, the way most understanding happens, not in one big moment but in the accumulation of small ones, each one adding a little more weight until the old shelf broke and you had to build a new one. They stopped trying to predict her moves in the war games. They stopped waiting for the aggression the xenobiological file had promised. They stopped treating the fact that she went for a run every morning at 500 like a behavioral symptom requiring analysis. They started instead watching, not with suspicion, something else, the particular quality of attention that precedes a revised opinion. Cadet Orensel of the Velshika, who had elegant posture and a 400-year family tradition in the Accord's diplomatic corps, and had arrived at the Institute absolutely certain of its own competence, started sitting near Jana in the strategy seminars, not because it had been told to, because Jana had a habit when working a problem of going quiet in a way that had texture, the specific silence of someone who had already found 3 options and was currently stress testing them. Orensel had learned to read the texture. When Jana went that particular kind of quiet, something useful was coming. Sanmir, the Marathi cadet, had a more complicated relationship with this development. Sanmir came from a civilization that had been refining military doctrine for 2,000 years. It had a working knowledge of 340 documented battle strategies. It had studied under 3 of its species' greatest living tactical minds. Before arriving here, it was not accustomed to finding the work of a junior-ranked human sergeant surprising. It found the work of Jana Voss surprising. This bothered it. It kept being honest with itself about the fact that it bothered it, that honesty, which was genuine and not without effort, was the thing that eventually moved it from bothered to something more useful. The war games escalated in month 3, not simulations anymore, full-scale strategic exercises, multi-phase, run over 72 hours with rotating parameters in real time, complications that the Institute's evaluators threw in without warning. The kind of exercises where you could see clearly and without mercy who people actually were when the pressure climbed and the options narrowed. The evaluators were looking for leadership signatures, the way each cadet's doctrine showed. itself under stress. The shape of their thinking when comfort was removed, Janna's signature was something they did not have a formal name for in Standard Accord doctrine. There was a metric called acceptable loss tolerant, the percentage of force depletion at which a commander shifted from offense to defense to withdrawal. Every species had one, calibrated by centuries of their own military history. Keth doctrine 22%, Marathi 31%, Velshika 15%. The highest in the accord belonging to a species called the Dreth, whose evolutionary history had made them effectively fearless, was 48%. On the second day of the third major exercise, Janna's simulated force took 61% casualties in a 6-hour engagement. She kept moving, not recklessly, not out of some refusal to see the numbers. She saw them. Velso was watching her face when the casualty updates came through, and it saw the precise moment each number landed. A slight pause, a breath, the jaw setting. She counted every single one. Then she moved her remaining forces to the next objective. At the 72% mark, the evaluator overseeing the exercise paused the scenario to ask if she wanted to invoke the withdrawal protocol. Janna looked at the map. Is that an option, or are you checking something? It is an option, then. No. She looked back at the map. What's my opponent's supply situation? Strained. They've been running hard to match you. Good, then 72% of my force is still enough to be someone's worst Tuesday. She moved her pieces. Continue. The exercise continued. She won in the end, not cleanly, not prettily, and at a cost that would have, in any standard doctrine framework, been classified as a failure state before the victory became possible. The evaluators spent 4 hours discussing it afterward. Their notes used the phrase times outside the expected loss continuation parameter times 7 times, and did not arrive at a satisfying conclusion. Desanmir sat next to Velso during the debrief and said quietly in Marathi, her civilization was almost destroyed 4 times in recorded history. Did you know that? Velso had read the human files. I know, and each time they were reduced to something that should not have been able to rebuild. Desanmir watched Janna at the strategy console, pulling up post-exercise analysis with the focused attention of someone already looking for what she could have done better. They rebuilt. Anyway, yes, that is not a historical fact, Desanmir said. That is a training program. She did not learn this, she inherited it. Velso thought about this for a long time. After the philosophical warfare module began in month 4, the instructor was a Keth professor named Sethora, ancient and dry and prone to long silences that she used the way other teachers used questions of the space. She expected you to fill with something honest. The module's first lesson was about what she called the core assumption, the deepest belief that every civilization carried into war, usually without knowing it, because it was so fundamental to their understanding of existence that it had never needed to be examined. For the Velshika, the core assumption was connection is worth preserving. Their warfare was sophisticated, precise, and almost always aimed at outcomes that preserved relationship. Even their enemies they preferred to defeat in ways that allowed for eventual repair. For the Keth, the core assumption was continuity is sacred. The long view, the preservation of the civilization's arc across centuries. Individual loss was real and mourned, but never at the expense of the thread. For the Marathi, the core assumption was knowledge once gained must not be lost. Their most protected military assets were never their generals. They were their historians. Sethora went around the room drawing these out, and each one was different, and each one was real, and by the time she had worked through 7 species, the shape of the lesson was visible, that beneath every military doctrine was a value, and beneath the value was a fear, and the fear told you what the civilization would die for and what it would not. She got to Jana last. Sergeant Voss, Sethora said, what is humanity's core assumption? Jana was quiet for a moment, not the thinking quiet that Orensel had learned to read something else slower, that it's not over, she said. Clarify. Whatever is happening, however bad, it's not over until it's actually over. And even when it looks like it's over, it might not be. She looked at the table. We've been nearly gone so many times. Ice ages, plagues, wars, things we did to ourselves. We kept going. I don't think it was because we were brave. I think it was because some part of us just doesn't accept the ending, even when we should. The room was quiet. Is that a strength? Sethora asked. I think it's just what we are, Jana said. Whether it's a strength depends on the day. Sethora looked at her for a long moment. Then she moved on, but Velso noticed that she didn't add Jana's answer to the board with the others. It stayed in the air, just hanging there, unclassified. It was the 6th week of month 4 when arch-strategist Delana arrived. Delana of the Marathi Combine was not introduced with fanfare because Delana did not require fanfare. She was the kind of person who generated gravity simply by being present, the way certain large objects do. She was 600 years old, approximately. By accord reckoning, she had served as supreme military commander for the Marathi Combine for 200 of those years. She had overseen 7 major engagements that were now taught as doctrine in every serious military institution. The galaxy. She sat in on a war game as an observer. Jana did not know who she was until after. She figured she was faculty. The war game was a coalition exercise. Multi-species forces, joint command, and enemy force that was running an asymmetric harassment campaign across supply corridor. The point of the exercise was coalition management. How do you lead effectively across species that have different doctrine, different values, different definitions of acceptable risk? Jana was assigned as one of 3 joint commanders. She didn't try to lead by rank. She didn't try to lead by personality. She sat in the middle of the command structure and started asking questions. Not strategic questions, specific ones. What does your doctrine prioritize here? What does a win look like to your force? What are you absolutely not willing to spend? Then she built the plan around the answers. It was not elegant. It was not the kind of battle plan that would be written into a military history. Because of its beauty, it was a plan that fit the specific people she was working with, that leveraged what they were already good at, that asked them to do nothing, that cut against their grain. It worked. Not perfectly. 3 objectives, 2 fully achieved and 1 partial. Casualties within every forces. Acceptable parameters. Coalition intact. At the end of the exercise, which was the hardest metric to hit and the most Important, after Deline left the observation gallery without speaking to anyone, she went directly to curator Admiral Orr. Orr's office was a room that felt like it had been thinking for 400 years. The walls held not books but the Keth equivalent condensed experience, stored in formats that required patience to read. The lighting was the pale gold that Keth preferred. Everything in the room was old and nothing in the room was careless. Deline sat across from him and looked at her hands for a moment. How many humans are there? She said. Approximately 9 billion active military, roughly 1.12 million in various branches at present. Their force posture has been relatively quiet for not active military. Deline looked up. Her eyes were rust red, the color Marathi eyes turned when they were doing the kind of thinking they saved for important problems. How many could be? Or was quiet. They are a planetary civilization with 70 years in space, Deline said. Every adult human in that civilization has to some degree what she has: the capacity to take loss and continue, the refusal to accept a fixed ending, the ability to work inside a coalition with different values and build something functional. She paused. You brought her here as a curiosity. Or said nothing. I watched the coalition exercise, Deline said. She didn't impose her doctrine. She asked everyone what their doctrine was and built around it. Do you understand what that means strategically? A force that can accommodate any partner, that can absorb any doctrine into its own thinking without losing coherence. Or folded 2 of his arms. This was, in Keth body language, posture of very serious consideration. What are you recommending? He asked. Nothing yet. I'm telling you what I see. Deline stood. She is not a curiosity, Thesson. She is a sample. And the sample suggests something that I would very much like to be wrong about, because being right about it is going to require the Accord to rethink a significant number of things. She left or sat in the dark of his office for a long time. Janet did not know about that conversation. She was in the commissary eating something that the menu listed as a protein composite and that tasted approximately like what she imagined a textbook would taste like if you cooked it. She was writing a letter home, not a transmission, actual handwriting on actual paper in English, because some habits were older than military service. Mom, she had written, the food here is genuinely something I will need to process for a long time. The people are. She had stopped there. She had tried several words. Colleagues, strange, impressive, surprising. She had left the sentence unfinished and moved to other things. Velso sat down across from her. She had gotten used to this over the past weeks. Velso didn't ask permission before sitting anymore, which she understood to be, in Keth's social terms, a significant indicator of comfort. She was choosing to take it as a compliment. You are writing something, Velso said. Let her home. My mom doesn't love transmissions, prefers paper. She looked at it. By the time it gets there, it'll be 6 weeks old, but she'll keep it. She keeps all of them. Velso looked at the letter without reading it. You miss her every day. She said it simply, without apology. But that's not the same as it being a problem. Velso thought about this. The Keth say distance is only absence. If you let it be a wall, that's a good one. Jana wrote something on the letter. We say home is wherever you put your coffee. Velso looked at her thermos. I believe that is a personal idiom rather than a cultural one. Jana laughed. They sat for a while, easy silence, the kind they had gotten good at. Then Velso said, the Kepler station incident in your file. Jana's pen slowed. 46 minutes. Velso said. She kept writing just a line or two, finishing a sentence. Were you afraid? Velso asked. She stopped writing. She set the pen down and looked at the table, not at Velso but not away either, just at the space in front of her. The whole time, she said. She picked up the pen. Velso waited for more. There wasn't more. The letter continued. The commissary made its ambient sounds. The stars outside the viewport held their positions, patient and enormous. Velso did not ask a follow-up question. Some things weren't questions. Some things were just true, and the space you gave them was the respect they deserved. And anything you said after them would only make them smaller. The whole time, 46 minutes, she kept going. Anyway, Velso sat with that for the rest of the evening and for several evenings. After, turning it over like something found on a beach, something worn smooth by a long time in the water, something that had been through things and come out the other side still solid. It did not file it anywhere. Some things didn't need a category. Some things were the category. The alarm did not sound like a drill. Jana knew the difference. She had known the difference since she was 22 years old, sitting in a base barracks on Mars, when the pressure alarm went off and half the people around her waited 4 full seconds to see if it was a test. Those 4 seconds cost 2 lives. She had never waited since. She was out of her bunk before the tone finished. Boots, jacket, data pad. The corridor was already filling with light cycling. To emergency red, the Institute's standard alert configuration. Through the viewport at the end of the hall, she could see the system star. Bright and still and indifferent. She could also see, in the space between the Institute's hull and the distant station markers, 3 shapes that had not been there an hour ago. She stopped at the viewport for exactly 1 second. Sketh class raiders, fast, angular, built for surgical strikes rather than sustained engagement, the kind of ships that existed in the jurisdictional gaps between accord space and the contested buffer zones, the kind that didn't carry flags because flags implied accountability. 3 of them. 1 was enough to be a problem. 3 was a message. She kept moving. The situation room was already active when she arrived, which meant she was either the 3rd or 4th person in the early risers, the light sleepers. Velso was at the communication array, or Incel was at the sensor display, with an expression that its species normally reserved for funerals. Thessenmere was standing in the center of the room, looking at the tactical overview with the flat, focused calm of someone running numbers. The evaluators and faculty were absent, not present. The facility's internal communications were partially down. The alert had cut across several standard channels and isolated the command wing from the student quarters, which meant that somewhere the adults were trying to get to the situation room and were not yet there. 32 cadets, no command staff. 3 ships outside. Jana looked at the tactical display for 20 seconds. The Sketh raiders were holding position, not attacking, not withdrawing. This was, she knew from the file sheet, read on unaffiliated operators, the standard opening of a leverage play. You showed up, you let the target see You waited for them to open communications and make the first nervous move, because the first nervous move told you everything about how the next hour was going to go. The Institute was a golden target for leverage. 32 cadets from 32 species, 600 years of strategic intelligence, accord charter protections that made direct assault politically costly, but negotiated seizure with enough deniability technically possible in the gaps. They weren't here to destroy the Institute, they were here to take it. Okay, Jana thought, that actually helps. She moved to the center of the room. Listen, she said. 14 cadets looked at her. The rest were still finding their footing in the alert, the noise, the red light, the absence of faculty. She did not raise her voice. She spoke at the volume of someone who expected to be heard, which was different from shouting, and landed differently. They haven't fired, and they're not going to fire first. This is a grab, not a strike. That gives us something to work with. She looked at the tactical display. We have time to be smart, not much, but some. You do not have command authority here, said a Dreth cadet, whose name translated approximately as time stone that does not move times in, who was, Jana had learned, a deeply principled being with a strong preference for explicit hierarchy. You're right, Jana said. I don't. If someone with command authority walks through that door in the next 2 minutes, I'll hand this to them immediately. She looked at the door, then back at Stone. Does that seem likely? A beat. Stone said nothing. She turned to the room. Velso, she said, get me a line to the lead ship, not the emergency broadcast. A direct line, ship to ship. If they respond, don't connect them to me yet. Keep them talking. Ask for identification. Ask for authorization. Codes. Ask for their captain's mother's name if you have to. I need them on that line, and I need them focused on the line. Velso was already moving. It had, in the past 4 months, developed what it privately recognized as a very specific response to Jana's particular kind of decisiveness, a kind of forward lean in its own processing, and aligning of resources. It did not examine this too carefully. Thesson, Jana said, you have the best spatial processing in this room. I need the access grid for the entire ship, not the emergency layout. The full schematic. I want to know where we are weak. Thesson, who was 2,000 years of military civilization, standing in a room making a decision about a human staff sergeant, had exactly 1 second of internal conflict. Then it moved to the schematic console. There was no dramatic internal speech, no moment of explicit deference. Thesson simply recognized, in the way that very experienced military minds recognize things, that the person in the room who was currently holding the most accurate picture of the problem was Jana Voss, and that the correct military response to that fact was to support the person with the best picture. That was all. It was enough. Jana moved through the room. Orancel, who could model 6 simultaneous social dynamics at once, and had spent 400 years in a family of diplomats. Take the secondary comm array. Monitor their internal traffic if you can get the frequency. Don't decode it yet, just log it. If they communicate in a pattern that suggests an imminent action shift, I need to know. Orancel, yes, a Keth cadet named Vertil, who had the fastest data processing speed in the room. I need the Institute's last 12 hours of external sensor logs. Anything that was moving in the system before those ships appeared, if they scouted us, I want to know when. Vertil already pulling the data. A Velshika cadet whose specialty was structural engineering and who had spent 3 months memorizing the Institute's converted generation ship architecture because she found old ships genuinely interesting. Walk me through the soft points on the exterior. Hull, not the weapon systems, the maintenance. Access points, places that aren't monitored because they're not supposed to matter. Cadet Lisferin looked at Jana for a moment, then pulled up her mental map. She had, she said, about 6 of those memorized. Jana listened. Velso opened the line. The Sketh lead ship responded within 40 seconds, which told Jana they were waiting to be called. They confirmed no identification, no authorization codes, standard operate procedure for operators who officially didn't exist. The voice that came through was translated as male by the Matrix with a flat affect that Jana recognized as professional comm. The professional comm of people who did this regularly and had learned to keep their temperature down. Belshira Institute. The voice said, "You are advised to cease all outbound communications and stand by for further instruction." Velso, following Jana's direction, responded with a request for identification, then a pause, then another question. The voice on the other end answered with patient authority. It was used to this part. It knew that scared institutions ask questions before they comply. It was expecting scared. In the situation room, Jana was not scared. She was the thing she always became when the shape of a problem got clear enough, focused, forward, burning through options at the speed that other people watching her sometimes found uncomfortable. There was a part of her brain that lived for this. She was not proud of it. She had never needed to be. The things I need, she was thinking. 6 minutes, maybe 8. She had the soft points from Lisferin. She had the sensor logs from Vertil. The Sketh ships had been in the outer system for 14 hours. They hadn't rushed. They were comfortable. They were not expecting resistance because this was a school and schools didn't resist. She had Velso keeping them on a line they thought was panic and was actually a clock. She had Thesson Mir at the schematic console and the picture of where they were weak and, more importantly, where they were not weak, which was the part of the picture that the Sketh commander was probably missing because the Institute's public specs did not accurately reflect the original generation ship's internal structure. Thesson Mir, she said low and direct. The aft section, the bulkheads. Original construction, Thesson Mir said pre-accord. Considerably more robust than current spec would suggest. How much force does it take to breach from outside? Pause. The number Thesson Mir gave her was, she could see from its expression, not what the Sketh would be working from. Good, she said. That's very good. She looked at the viewport on the side wall, the starfield. She stopped. 1 second, just one. The stars were where they always were, out there, enormous and still somewhere in that direction. 40-something light years, a kitchen with good light and better coffee. Her mother kept all the letters. She turned back to the room. Timer is moving, she thought. Back to the problem. The plan was not elegant. She was aware of this. It had corners and improvised joints and one section that relied on a piece of information she was not completely certain about. She built it anyway. Because a plan with weak sections that exists is worth 17 perfect plans that don't. The Institute's power grid had a series of nodes that fed the external communication array. The one the Sketh were monitoring. Standard tactical assumption. The grid was fragile. Standard tactical mistake. The original generation ship had redundancy built into the power system at every level because deep space vessels could not afford single points of failure the Sketh would expect when they decided the line had gone quiet long enough to be dealing with an institution whose primary communication capability was knocked out and whose external systems were compromised. They would not expect a school to have working secondary and tertiary systems rooted through structural nodes that weren't on the public schematic. They would not expect the school to have already sent a distress call through those systems 40 minutes ago, rooted at narrow bandwidth through the Institute's long-range science array addressed to the nearest Accord security installation. They would not expect the school to then resume communications on the primary array, calm and compliant, buying the time the distress call needed to travel. Verdal had done the math on the response time, 90 minutes best case, maybe 110. Jana needed the Sketh comfortable and patient for 90 minutes. She gave Velso what to say. The hour that followed was, in ways she would not fully process until much later, the longest of her time at the Institute, not because it was the most dangerous. She had had worse. She had the door and the 46 minutes and the singular clarifying knowledge that the only thing between 63 people and vacuum was her hands and her back and whatever she was made of. This was longer because she was not alone, because she was working inside a room full of people who were afraid in ways she could see. The held stillness, the careful voices, the checking and rechecking of things that were already set. She could see Velso's skin doing the faint bioluminescent flicker that she had learned meant Keth stress response. She could see Orincel maintaining perfect composure on the outside and something else entirely in the tight lines around its expression. She could see Thesson Mir watching her, not looking to her for reassurance. Something more complicated, a 2000 military mind from a civilization that had seen everything, watching a human staff sergeant work a problem in revising something. She walked and checked and kept everyone on task and answered questions and twice redirected Velso when the line with the Sketh started to drift in a direction that felt like losing them. She moved through the room with the same quality of attention she gave everything complete and forward, and not spending a single unit of processing on whether this was going to work. At the 73rd minute, the Accord security response arrived. It did not arrive quietly. The debrief happened the next day. Arch strategist Dylan ran it personally, or was present but did not speak for most of the session. Faculty were there, and the evaluators, and all 32 cadets, some still with the particular hollow quality around the eyes that came from a night of sustained alert. Dylan went through it methodically. The timeline, the decisions, the outcomes. 3 cadets had injuries from a partial hull stress event during the Raiders' attempt to disengage. Nothing severe, significant system damage to the secondary comm array. 2 cadets who would need psychological support in the weeks ahead. Everyone accounted for. The threat neutralized. Dylan looked at Jana. What was your contingency if the primary plan failed? Another plan, Jana said, and if that failed? Another one. A pause. The room was very quiet. You would have kept going, Dylan said. It was not a question. Jana looked at her with the expression of someone to whom the question did not fully compute. Not because she found it strange, but because the answer was so basic, it barely felt like an answer. That's what you do, she said. Dylan nodded once. She moved on to the next item on the debrief. The session continued. The notes were taken. The decisions were evaluated. The points of improvement were identified and cataloged, but in the room something had changed shape. Not loudly. Not all at once. More like the way a season changes. You can't point to the exact moment. You just notice at some point that the air is different. 31 cadets from 31 civilizations who had come to this school carrying their own doctrine, their own history, their own accumulated centuries of military wisdom, and who had spent a night working inside a plan built by a human staff sergeant who had no authority except the clarity of her picture of the problem, and who had followed it not because they had to, because it was the right picture. Velso, sitting in the second row, looked at the back of Jana's head and thought about what Thesenmir had said months ago. She did not learn this. She inherited it. 9 billion people. The sample suggested something. Velso sat with that and found that it did not have the word for the feeling it produced, not in Keth, not in any language it had learned here. It looked it up later in a human language database. The closest match it found was not a military term. It was a word from a human religious tradition. The word was times all. The last 2 months were quieter, not because the work was lighter. The curriculum in the final stretch was the most demanding it had been, full of multi-week strategic exercises and papers that the Institute expected to be genuine contributions to military theory, not student work. But something in the texture of the place had changed. The air was different, the way people moved around each other in the corridors, in the commissary, in the strategy rooms. Jana noticed it the way she noticed most things, not all at once but piece by piece, until the whole picture assembled itself. They had stopped treating her as an anomaly, not because she had stopped being one. She was still the only human. She still went for runs at 500 and packed 3 thermoses and talked about Kansas with the unself-conscious ease of someone who had no complicated feelings about where she came from. She was still the person in every war game who found the angle the scenario assumed no one would look for, but the otherness had changed quality. It was no longer the otherness of times, something we don't understand times, and had become the otherness of times, someone we know who is also different from us, which is a different thing entirely. The difference between looking at a locked box and looking at a person or in cell had at some point in month 9 started sending her drafts of its strategic papers before submission, not for correction, for the thing she did when she read them, which was to find the section where the author's core assumption was showing and ask one question about it, not challenging. Just, have you looked at this from this angle? Or Incel had decided this was worth more than most feedback it had ever received, and had said so with the Velshika directness that Jana had come to appreciate because it never hid inside politeness. Thessalmer had invited her, 3 months from the end, to participate in a joint research project on coalition doctrine, specifically on the question of how to build joint command structures across species with fundamentally different core assumptions. Jana had agreed. Her contribution to the paper's final section was, by the time they submitted it, larger than either of them had originally planned, because she kept having things to say that were useful, and Thessalmer had the intellectual honesty to simply include them. The paper was, years later, required reading in the Institute's curriculum. Neither of them knew that yet. Curator Admiral or called her to his office in month 13. She had been there twice before, once for administrative purposes at the start, once in the aftermath of the greater incident. The office still felt the same way it had those first 2 times, old and intentional, a room that had accumulated meaning the way certain objects do, through time and use, and the quality of attention that had been paid in it, or was sitting in the posture she now recognized as time's informal consideration, times which in Keth terms was about as relaxed as they got. He gestured to the seat across from him. With one of his forearms she sat. "Your assessment cycle is complete," he said. "I know, I got the notification. Your results are," the phrase the evaluation board used was times outside existing classification parameters. "They are working on new ones." He looked at her. "This happens rarely, 3 times in 612 years." Jana wasn't sure what to do. With that, she left it alone. "I want to ask you something," Orr said. "Not for the record, not for the Institute's assessment. Just because I am curious, and I am old enough to ask the things I'm curious about without worrying about the framing." "Okay. When you arrived, you were aware that the invitation was not," he paused, "that there was a perspective within the committee, that it was more observation than genuine inclusion." "I figured it was a joke," Jana said, "or close to one, and you came anyway." "Yes." "Why?" She looked at the desk for a moment, then at the viewport where the stars were doing what stars always did. "When I was about 12 years old," she said, "my school had a science competition. Regional thing. I built this model of a solar pressure sail, really basic. Nothing impressive. But I'd worked on it for weeks. I was the only kid from a public school. In the final round, everyone else was from the technical academies. I knew I wasn't going to win." She paused. "My mom asked me if I wanted to drop out, save myself the trip, or waited. I went anyway," Jana said. "Came in 4th out of 9, got to talk to an actual aerospace engineer for 20 minutes. About solar dynamics." She looked at Orr. "The joke. If that's what this was, I got 14 months. Out of it, I got Velso and Thessalmer's paper and Sethra's class and the thing with the Raiders." She paused. "I got to find out what I was in a room with. The joke, if it was a joke, cost me nothing." Or was quiet for a moment. "It was not a joke," he said. "I know. You knew before I told you." "Yeah." She looked at him steadily. "You don't spend 400 years building the most serious military institution in the galaxy and then throw a vote away on a joke. You wanted to know what we were. I wanted to know what you were." She held his gaze. "I think we both got an answer," or looked at her with his gold eyes. For a long moment his expression was genuinely unreadable, not because Keth faces were opaque to her anymore, but because what was on his face was not A single thing, it was the layered quality of someone who had arrived at a conclusion they had been moving toward. For a long time, he said, the Accord is going to have to think very carefully about humanity in the years ahead. I figured this does not alarm you, no. She looked at the viewport. We've been thought about carefully before, usually by ourselves, which is how we get into trouble. Having the outside perspective might actually help. Pause. Also, it's not like you have a choice. We exist. That ship has sailed. Or made a sound that Jana had, over 14 months, come to identify as the Keth equivalent of a laugh that didn't quite make it out. No, he said, it has not. Graduation, the Institute didn't call it that, using instead the Keth term that translated approximately as times the completion of the first. Understanding times was a small affair. By ceremony standards, the 32 cadets in the big circular room where Sethra had asked about core assumptions and or had watched Jana present her first scenario. Jana stood in line with everyone else and received the same formal acknowledgement, the same data credential, the same brief moment of Or's complete attention as he looked at each of them in turn. When he got to Jana, he held the look for 2 seconds. Same as the first day, she held it back. He moved on. Velso walked her to the transit dock. It was the same dock she had arrived at 14 months ago, different light or the same light at a different time. She couldn't tell. The Velshika coordinator was not there this time. Different one was, and it processed her departure with efficient courtesy and none of the particular posture adjustment of the arrival. She and Velso stood at the gate. The liaison assignment, Velso said. Earth's office, you really putting in for it? I submitted the transfer request this morning. It paused. There are aspects of human operational thinking that I believe would benefit from extended direct study. That's a very academic way to say you want to see Kansas. I do want to see Kansas, Velso said with the perfect seriousness of something that was not making a joke. Your descriptions have been consistent and evocative. The agricultural plains, the sky at night. Jana smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't have any performance in it. My mom makes a good breakfast. I'll warn her you're coming. They were quiet for a moment. Thank you, Velso said. She looked at it. For what? For being. It paused, running through options. For being the thing you are. Without apology. I did not know that I needed to see that until I had seen it. Jana didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at her boots, then at the viewport, then at Velso. You too, she said. The transit announcement came through. She picked up her bag, 3 thermoses. Somewhere in the bottom of it, she had not run out of the good blend once in 14 months, which she considered one of her finer logistical achievements. She went through the gate. The shuttle home smelled like standard recycled air and a faint note of the synthetic meal packets they served on long-haul flights. Jana ate one without complaint, drank from her thermos, and fell asleep somewhere. Around hour 3, she dreamed about the Raider incident, not the tense part, not the 90 minutes of clock watching and careful words and Velso's glowing skin. The part after the debrief, Dalen's question, you would have kept going. She had not heard it as a compliment in the moment. She had heard it as an observation, the way you say water runs downhill, just the nature of the thing. She woke up 3 hours out from Earth and looked out the shuttle window at the Stars and then at the slow brightening point that was the sun growing. Recognizable and then at the small blue-white bead that was home. She watched it grow for a while. The house looked the same. It always looked the same. That was one of the things she had held on to through Kepler Station and the transfers and the 14 months in a school 600 light years away. The same white paint, the same fence that her mother had been meaning to repaint for 15 years, the same porch with the same chairs. Her mother was at the door before Jana reached the porch steps. She was a small woman with gray-shot hair and the kind of face that belonged to someone who had worked hard their whole life and had no complaints about it. She hugged Jana the way she always had, completely, without reservation. Hug that had no self-consciousness in it whatsoever. Jana hugged her back. You look thin, her mother said. The food was an adventure. Come in and eat something. Jana came in and ate something. Her mother made eggs and toast and the coffee that was exactly as good as she had told Velso it was, sitting in the commissary that early morning a year and 2 months ago. She sat at the kitchen table. Her mother moved around the kitchen and the light came in at the angle it always had, and the coffee was exactly right. And outside the window Kansas was being exactly what it always was, flat and large and wind-brushed and quietly. Specifically itself. How was it, her mother asked. Interesting. Good. Interesting or bad? Interesting. Jana considered both. All of it. She drank her coffee. I'll tell you some of it sometime. Her mother sat down across from her with her own coffee and looked at Jana with the clear attention of a person who had been watching someone for 29 years and could read most of what wasn't being said. She didn't push. This was one of the things Jana had always loved about her. 3 weeks later, a transmission came through the Institute's official channel to her service address. Jana read it on her data pad, sitting on the porch in the early evening with the sky going orange and pink and the wind doing what the wind always did. The transmission was from the Accord's Strategic Assessment Division. Formal language, official headers. The body of the message was brief, as part of an ongoing review of intercivilizational military cooperation frameworks. The Accord was establishing a new classification tier for civilizations with potential strategic significance beyond current developmental status. It was being called in the official documentation the Extended Assessment Tier. Earth was the fourth civilization in 600 years to be assigned to it. The tone of the message was administrative, careful, the kind of language that had been reviewed by several departments before it was sent. Jana read it twice. She set the data pad down on the arm of the chair. Sky was doing something extraordinary. The clouds were catching the last light in a way that had no right to be as beautiful as it was. Orange and deep red bleeding into each other over the flat line of the horizon, the way only Kansas skies could, because there was nothing in the way. She looked at it for a while. Well, hell, she thought, and did not mean it as a complaint. 2 days after that, another message came. This one was from Velso, Accord header from the Earth Liaison Office, which meant the transfer had been approved. The body of the message was 3 sentences. The transfer has been approved. I arrive in 6 weeks. I have been informed by your human agricultural databases that Kansas has a phenomenon called a thunderstorm, which, by the meteorological description, appears to involve significant Atmospheric electrical discharge visible from a considerable distance. I would like to see this, Jana laughed. She read it twice and laughed both times. She wrote back 3 sentences. Welcome. My mom will make breakfast. Wait until you see what the sky does. She hit send. Somewhere 600 light years away, and then increasingly less far, an old convert generation ship turned in its orbit. 31 cadets were dispersed back to their civilizations, carrying with them 14 months of education and something else. Something harder to document, harder to classify. Something that lived between the facts and was not quite any one of them alone, and in offices and committees and quiet rooms across the accord, minds that had been moving toward a question for some time were beginning at last to form the words for it, not yet, not all at once, but beginning in his office in the pale gold light that Keth preferred Curator Admiral Thesson, or read the classification tier notification and then looked out his viewport for a long time. He thought about a Tuesday, a backup selection, a woman who had arrived at his dock with a kit bag in 3 thermoses and the quiet certainty of something that already knew what it was. He thought about one vote. One vote, cast not as a joke and not quite as an experiment and not fully as any category that had existed in the committee's working vocabulary, cast as the thing it actually was, which was a door left open because the shape of what would walk through it was not yet known, and some things deserved to be seen. He had been right, he was not sure yet about what he had been right about, not the full shape of it. That would take years, decades. Possibly. The Accord moved carefully because it had learned at great cost across 600 years what happened when large things moved without care, but the direction was visible. He had watched Jana Voss work a room, a problem, a crisis, a relationship. He had watched her count her losses and keep moving. He had watched her ask the questions that got to the shape of other people's values and build her work around the answers, not around herself. He had watched 9 billion people in one person. The sample suggested something. He thought about Dalen's question, how many could be. He looked at the stars. He wrote one line in his private record, encrypted, the record he had kept for 400 years and would keep for however many more he had. One line which no one would read for 30 years, and which when they read it would make the Accord Strategic Assessment Division retrieve all their files on humanity and begin again from the beginning. The line read, we thought we were watching something primitive learn. We were watching something ancient remember. He closed the record. The stars held their positions. The door which he had opened stayed open. The rest was someone else's century.